be kind of informal. So if you have questions at any point in the talk, just raise your hand. I can't help but put my professor hat on for a bit, so you're going to learn some basic evolutionary theory, but the star of the night is going to be Redonda and the really exciting conservation work happening on the island. So bear with me for a bit. I'm going to give you some big picture background about lizards and evolution, some of the other research that I've been working on, and then really dive into all of the exciting things happening on Redonda. So, broadly speaking, I'm interested in understanding how humans change the environment, how animals adapt to respond to those changes, and what that means for the stability and conservation of ecological systems. I got my start actually in Kenya, right here in the middle of Kenya, in a little province called Laikipia, working at a research center with this fascinating history of human land use in the savannah. We are surrounded by giraffes and elephants and lions, and all sorts of exciting big African mammals, but of course I was interested in little tiny lizards. So traditionally, cattle raised in this habitat are penned overnight in these temporary shelters called bomas. They're ringed with fences, and basically every night cattle come into the boma, spend the night safe away from predators, and in the meantime drop tons and tons of manure. Now, over time, these super nutrient-rich patches end up leaching out into the surrounding savanna, such that you can actually even see them from satellites. This creates this nutrient hotspot in the savanna, all due to these traditional human practices. What I was interested in is how this little lizard, Legidactylus kenyensis, a little gecko, lives in these different habitats in the savanna. What I found was that around these bomas that persist for decades, even as much as a century after the cattle have moved, you get really high densities of these lizards, higher than anywhere else in the savanna. In turn, you also find more insects that are eating the nutrient-rich grasses, and you see grasses and trees that are growing faster than anywhere else in the landscape. So it's this finding that started making me think about connecting the dots between humans changing the environment, species adapting to those changes, and the mix of all of those interactions creating this new, even more sustainable ecosystem for both humans and the environment, and the species in the environment to coexist. So I've been tracking down similar questions, and I've been very fortunate to do so all over the world. So that project was in Kenya. I spent some time in South Africa. Recently, my work has been spent in Greece, and you can see there's quite a bit of projects right in this neck of the woods as well. Now, you'll notice a bit of a theme here as well. There's a lot of lizards. And so I often get asked, well, why lizards? There's a couple different reasons. I didn't actually grow up chasing lizards like a lot of my herpetologist friends and colleagues. But lizards are really important for ecosystems in ways that we wouldn't necessarily expect. Because they're very common, well, one, that makes them pretty easy to catch a lot of for a sample size, but they're also really important players in an ecosystem. They eat a lot of bugs and a lot of different types of bugs, and so you can kind of tell how well the insect community is doing based on how well the lizard community is doing. Now, lizards are also really good food sources for other animals like birds and snakes and cats. And so, based on how well the lizard community is doing, you can extrapolate a little bit about how well the predators of the lizards might also be doing. So they occupy this really important pivot point in food webs that make them pretty valuable for looking at all of these different dynamics that I'm interested in. Doesn't hurt that they're really cute. They tend to live in warm places, which is always nice. I seem to have always lived in cold places, Boston and Minnesota and Maine. So getting to travel to go catch lizards is really nice. And their time schedule is so much better. They wake up about 9 o'clock in the morning, they take a siesta around noon, and then go back to bed before sunset, so that, yeah, my friends who study birds at 4 o'clock in the morning are very jealous. Now, another thing that's special about lizards, or especially the lizards right here in your backyard, is they're extremely diverse. I don't know if you've heard of lizards called anoles. I don't know if that's a familiar name. It's a genus describing about 400 different species of lizards, all living just in this little range. And actually, the vast majority of them are living right in through here. These lizards are known for having lots of different shapes and sizes, colors, and behaviors. They're characterized by these bright dewlaps. You've probably seen a couple dewlapping as you walk around in gardens. These dewlaps are used for signals between males and females, and between males and other males, trying to get them to back out of their territories. So these anoles, in general, provide a really useful study system for asking evolutionary questions, because we can compare what one species of anole has done in one place to another species of anole in a similar place, or the same species of anole in two very different places, and how have they changed? These are the types of questions that I'm interested in asking with anoles. In terms of your backyard, you have a few anoles right here. This is Anolis wansea. It's a little brown anole. You'll probably see it scurrying around at the bottom of trees, and they're very abundant, but kind of fast. You might not see them. This is Anolis leachii, Leach's anole. It's quite a bit larger. It has green and blue. It's very colorful. They're characters. I like that. This is the star. This is the anole that really has a special place in my heart. This is Anolis nubilis, and it is only found on Redonda. So the only place in the world that you can find this species is on a rock just a little ways east of here. We're going to talk more about Anolis, a whole lot more about Anolis nubilis soon, but a little bit more about lizards. How do you catch lizards? They're really fast, often they're small, and when they're not small, they're even harder to catch for other reasons. So this is what it looks like. This is actually a colleague of mine hanging over a cliff. It's about, I'd say 150 meters down to the ocean, and he just caught this little lizard. So he's got a long fishing pole, at the end of which is a little string with a slip knot. He has to sneak up to the lizard, loop the string around the lizard's neck, and then yank it. And he's got a lizard. Luckily, the lizards have really strong necks, and their scales protect them, so it doesn't hurt the lizard at all. But it's a lot better than having to crawl out on those branches and try to get them by hand, which we also do. So this is the preferred lizard capturing method. If you want to try it yourself, I've actually seen people do it with long stems of grass. It's much harder though. So get yourself a lizard fishing pole. All right, so that's a little bit about lizards, my background, and how we do this kind of work. I want to talk a little bit about the big picture, about how I am thinking about the questions involved in this conservation project specifically, but my research in general. So we have to talk about evolution. Now, evolution we define as a change in heritable characteristics of a biological population over successive generations. So just to break that down a little bit, we're looking at characteristics, traits, so that could be arm length or your height, that are heritable. That means that parents look like offspring, or rather offspring look like parents. And biological populations, of course, is kind of vague. It could mean a lot of different things depending on the question you're interested in. For me, biological populations that I'm curious are usually related to just a single island. And if that same species was on a different island, I would consider them separate if there's not lizards going back and forth. But other questions might be interested in looking at a biological population that encompasses the whole species everywhere it's found. Now, successive generations is the last key here. That's looking at these traits as they change one after another, generation after generation, parent to offspring. This part is the only bit that's changing a little bit, and you'll see what I mean by that. Now we have two fellows to thank in particular for this. I think this is probably familiar. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace were the first to synthesize these ideas about how species change through time. They summed it up with two key concepts that is relevant for our discussion of evolution. One is simply descent with modification, and the other is survival of the fittest. Now, these two ideas are kind of wrapped into that previous definition, but I think it's useful to focus on those specifically. So descent with modification, that is looking at those changes in traits through successive generations, through successive years. Survival of the fittest has to do with connecting that trait to the environment. And so you can see this is where I start to get excited. So survival of the fittest means whatever trait you have that is heritable and makes you look like your parent gives you an advantage over others in that biological population such that you make more babies, long and short. And so if you are successful in passing on that trait, more and more and more of your offspring and grand-offspring and great-grand-offspring will look like you, and the population as a whole is going to shift in a new direction that is better suited to its habitat. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now, conventionally, this was a very long and slow process. Let me see if I can get back one more. You can see across the top here, well, you can't see it, it's really tiny. You take my word for it, across the top is a timeline stretching into the tens of millions of years. And this shows basically our recreation of the evolution of whales from a land mammal that, looks kind of, I don't know, like a little dog. This, you can tell this takes a lot of descent, a lot of modification. There's some very large changes happening here. But this kind of perspective on evolution was derived from really the only kind of comparison that we could make over such a long time scale, fossils. Now, by looking back at the fossil record, we can trace how we got from a dog to a whale, and we can also tell that had this ancestor taken a different path, he would have ended up being a hippopotamus. But those millennia of evolution all stacking up gives us kind of a narrow view of how evolution works. It suggests that evolution requires millions of generations, many millions of years. And we're realizing that's not quite the way evolution actually works. And so there's been, just in the last 10 or 15 years, this revival of interest in evolution as a very dynamic process, as something that happens constantly. That between every successive generation, there could be shifts in these traits that make a population better suited to its surroundings. Can even make a population worse suited to its surroundings in the next generation because maybe surroundings have changed. So this much more dynamic perspective on evolution has caused us to reevaluate a lot of questions that we had asked about how species interact and assumptions that we had made about how ecosystems work. Now, a lot of these findings have been illustrated using lizards, which is why I have lots of pretty lizards up here in one of the journals. I'm going to give you an example of some of my work that demonstrates this rapid evolution in progress. Just a second. So before I move on to my own work, I want to quickly tie this back to conservation. Why is all of this important for conservation? And this is one of the big ideas I want you to kind of leave with at the end of the night. So I'm going to circle back to this at the very end. But this idea is, if plants and animals can rapidly and flexibly adapt to their surroundings, then protecting species in our era of unprecedented environmental changes might be made easier by capitalizing on evolutionary tools already ingrained in their DNA. So that's kind of a lot. I think we'll get back to it and we'll be able to pick that apart a little bit. But I'm really excited about the opportunity for conservation biology to start harnessing the insights from evolutionary biology so that we can actually help species help themselves. Okay, so let's talk about hurricanes. Last fall, it's a really bad hurricane year. I was in Turks and Caicos about a week before Hurricane Irene went through. So here, let me just back up. So this Turks and Caicos, we're a little bit further north. I was staying on Water Key and Pine Key surveying this lizard, Anolis scriptus. This is actually part of a project on another rat eradication. It's a sister project to the Redonda restoration effort. So I was looking at Anolis scriptus, taking measurements of its arms and its head and its diet and its behavior. All the same types of data that I'll present for a second in Redonda. For example, here is us just walking around a plot where we were catching lots and lots of lizards. So this is typical vegetation. It was full up of lizards. We were catching lizards and measuring them. Now, shortly, about a week after we left Turks and Caicos, Hurricane Irma rolled through. Maria was a few weeks after that. Hundreds of miles an hour winds. The islands were devastated. And here's just a picture of that same habitat. You might recognize it, but the vegetation looks completely different. And so we realized this was a unique chance to go back and actually test survival of the fittest after this very, very short time period, but this absolutely devastating natural disaster. So we went back 6 weeks after our initial survey to measure the population of remaining lizards and see if any had survived and whether the ones that had survived looked different from the population as a whole before the hurricanes. Here's what we found. Again, I apologize, these are a little small. So these two graphs up top are relating to the humerus, that's the long bone in the arm. These two graphs in the bottom relate to the size of the femur, the length of the femur, it's the long bone in the legs. Both of these traits we know are really important for how lizards move through the environment. We found, so the dotted line here is the relative length of the femur or the humerus before the hurricanes. The solid line is the length, the average length of the population after the hurricanes. What you'll notice is they're different. It turns out they're statistically different, which means that this didn't just happen by chance. There's actually something underlying this major difference that we see. And so, humerus, the humeri, the arms, got longer in the survivors. That means that on average, the surviving lizards had longer arms, but they had shorter legs, which is really weird. That's kind of not a typical combination that you would see in lizards. Usually long-armed lizards also have long legs. But the survivors were different. They had long arms and long legs, short legs. this was surprising. This was weird. Another result was related to these toe pads. Now, if you've ever caught one of the anoles, or even just watched them climb up a wall, you know that their feet, hands and feet, are very sticky. Well, they're not actually sticky in a gooey sense, but they have these special structures called lamellae. Here you can see a zoomed in picture of the hand and the foot. These lamellae allow them to basically grip on just about any surface. They're really impressive. Now, the size of the lamellae can be highly variable within a population. And so we measured the actual surface area of each of these fingers and toes, both before and after the hurricanes, to see if there had been any differences in the populations. And again, we found really significant differences that before, in both the hind feet and the hands, the lamellae were on average smaller, but the survivors were only the ones with the really big lamellae. So this gave us a clue that maybe this has something to do with clinging, that their ability to survive the storm, survive the high winds of the storm specifically, might have to do with how well they can hold on to something. So we tested this. I got the biggest leaf blower I could find. Yes, a question?
I just got a little confused. You said that the hinds and the hands are on average smaller, but yet so it was overall larger?
That's right. So before the hurricanes, the populations had, on average, smaller toe pads, little lamellae, but they had relatively longer legs. And so we're talking, there's a lot of different traits, so it's hard to figure out which way each is going. But you're right. They had smaller toe pads but longer legs. And then after the hurricanes, they had shorter legs and larger toe pads. Thanks. Okay, so maybe it has something to do with clinging. So I brought with me the largest leaf blower that I could find. You can see where this is going. Set it up point blank for a little perch with lots and lots of padding. Put a lizard on the perch, blasted it with air, and tried to figure out how lizards behave in hurricane-force winds. Because we actually didn't know. It's not surprising that nobody went out with a notebook during a hurricane to watch for lizards. But we wanted to test to see, what does a lizard do? Here's the answer. So let me just get you oriented. There's a little dial down here. It's pretty faint, but it has, it's basically just a speedometer for the wind speed. Up above is this perch. This is kind of a typical perch for this species, so we used it for that reason. And clinging on is this little anole, Anolis scriptus. So we're about to ramp up the wind, and we'll see what happens. So we're already at 65 miles per hour. And you can see these back legs are catching a lot of wind. This is a problem for the lizard. So we're now at about 75 miles per hour, 80 miles per hour, 82. Lost the back limbs. But he's still holding on strong. So we just passed 85 miles an hour. We're about to get to 90 miles an hour. He's doing great. 98 miles an hour. And there he goes. So he fell off at 106 miles per hour, which is really impressive. I'm pleased to report that nobody was injured. Everybody was fine. The key to notice here, I'll get you in just a second. The key to notice here is the thing that fell off first were the legs. That happened over and over and over again. We did this to about 50 different lizards. Every time, well, just about every time, it was their hind legs that were catching wind. So we realized that in order to get a good grip on a perch, the lizards sit with their hands above their head and their elbows tucked in really tight, basically behind the perch. But in order to get a good grip with their feet, they kind of have to sit like this with their knees out. And that's a real problem if you've got wind coming by, because you're going to catch wind with your legs. And if your legs are particularly long, you're going to catch more wind, which means that might be the survival of the fittest. You get blown out to sea and then you don't swim back. You had a couple questions.
Okay, so like during this experiment, how exactly do you keep the lizard from losing off the perch?
Yeah, that was one of the big questions that we weren't sure if the lizard was just going to get off the perch. And by and large, they didn't. And so that in and of itself was a surprise. Some of the lizards jumped down before the winds really started. And so just at the very beginning, they would kind of try to get away from us and jump off the perch. But once winds started blowing, I think it's much safer for them to just hunker down and try to ride it out than to jump and risk getting blown off. So it's a great question. You had a question too? Same one. All right, so here's an interesting result. 6 weeks passed, 2 catastrophic hurricanes, and the whole population of lizards living on 2 different islands changed fundamentally in the same way. Now, we scientists really like seeing the same thing happen twice, because we like to think that means it probably didn't have to do with chance. Maybe there's something really underlying this whole process that is repeatable and predictable. That we saw it on 2 islands in the same direction makes us think that maybe actually hurricanes can cause direct selection on different phenotypes, that is how a body looks, of these lizards, such that 6 weeks later, the genetic characteristics of that whole population have fundamentally changed. So, there's this question, is this evolution? Well, yeah, except for the part about successive generations. And that's a bit of a tricky question that we're not sure how to address. But what we do know is that the population of survivors looks fundamentally different from the population that was there 6 weeks earlier. And these leg length traits are definitely heritable. And so, because of these hurricanes, the evolutionary path, the evolutionary trajectory of this species just took a hard turn. Pretty cool. Now, what's next for these lizards? Well, we don't know. Hurricanes are getting more frequent. And so, it's entirely possible that Turks and Caicos could be hit again next year, which would maybe...
This year.
Or next year. And the years after that. Yeah. And so, it's possible that year after year, these changes could accrue, and surviving lizards could be really well adapted to surviving hurricanes. If, however, there's a stronger pressure to survive relative to other things, like how well you catch food, or
Sorry, Siri.
or how well you can defend your territory from another male, then maybe evolution is going to get kind of pulled in a different direction. And we won't see this result anymore in limb length, and in fact, maybe dewlap color will change. We don't know. We have to keep measuring, keep watching.
Maybe they'll start to swim.
Entirely. But we do know that in such a short amount of time, we're way away from the hundreds of millions of years. Now we're talking about a month and a half. Evolution happened on these islands. So what does all that mean for Redonda? Now, how many of you have actually had a chance to be on Redonda? All right, it's not now. Okay, great. So, for those of you who haven't, this is Redonda. It is an unbelievably beautiful but harsh rock out in the ocean. The places that aren't steep are cliff. It's incredible to actually walk along these ridges and see these views. Actually, I'm going to give you a little perspective on what it actually looks like. Okay, so here's a flight around Barbuda. There's no. The ecology of Barbuda was out of balance. It was infested with rats. There were rats everywhere. And rats are pests for lots of fragile island ecosystems. They eat eggs, both of lizards and of birds, and they're just a problem. They're not supposed to be there. Now, there are also goats on Barbuda, and because of the goats expanding their populations, they'd actually eaten down the vegetation. They didn't have enough food for themselves to sustain themselves. So, the Barbuda Restoration Project decided to eradicate the rats, rehome the goats back on Antigua, and restore Barbuda back to where it should have been originally. So I came in to ask the question, how do the lizards adapt when we eradicate rats? Okay, so what measurements did we take? Well, one of the key concerns about the population was, well, just how many lizards are there? And we figured that immediately after the rats were taken off, the density of the lizards would increase. They wouldn't have the predator and wouldn't have a competitor for the food that they eat, and so life is going to be good for the lizards. There's a couple different ways to measure lizard density. And so we actually use two different ones. One is called marker capture. We set up two different permanent stations on the island. One is on a lot of rocks, which kind of typifies the island. Another is on one of the only trees we could find, which is kind of where we imagine the population wants to live and will be living in 5, 10, 50 years once the trees have had a chance to grow back. So in these plots, we would run around with our lizard poles, catch as many as we can, individually paint numbers on their bellies or backs, and then revisit 2 days later to see how many of the lizards we had caught were still there. The idea being that if we found new lizards on the second day, that means that there were some that we missed the first time. And so the actual population living in that place is a little bit larger. And we can use some equations to figure out exactly how much larger we would expect it to be. All right, so here's lizard number 5. We had a lot of lizards that way. Now, another thing that we tried were these just visual surveys where we walked around the entire perimeter of the island. This kind of gives you a sense. This is, first of all, this is a badly drawn map. It's my fault. But there's only this little bit of Barbuda that's actually walkable, and even that is questionable. So we did a tour around the whole thing, counting up all of the lizards that we saw on the way, specifically the ground lizards and the anoles. We ended up surveying the geckos in a different way. The geckos are pretty nocturnal. That means that they are most active at night, and they live under rocks, so we wouldn't see them on a visual encounter survey like this. So the team and I flipped 100 rocks every night and just counted up how many geckos we saw. Now, we were also interested in how the lizards were using their habitat. Now, we were a little bit less interested in how the ground lizards were using their habitat because we expected to stay on the ground even if vegetation changes. But the tree lizards were on rocks. And we suspect that they're going to want to go back to trees once the trees grow in. So we took a lot of different measurements about what height the lizards were perching at and how big a diameter was the rock or tree or vegetation of any kind that they were perching on. And how far was it to the nearest perch that seemed closest to them. That gives us a little sense for how the lizards are choosing where to hang out in the environment. And we also measured flight initiation distance. I made a little cartoon later that's going to really show you what I mean by that. Finally, well, not quite finally, we measured the morphology. So this is the physical appearance of the lizard. So we measured each of the bones and the arms and the legs and a lot of different head measurements. All of these measurements have something to do with how lizards live, survive, and adapt to their environment. All right, so we got a lot of data on the lizards themselves. We took fancy pictures of the dewlaps of the anoles. The ground lizards don't have dewlaps, more's the pity. But we also took pictures of the lamellae, just like the hurricane anoles. And we flushed the stomachs of about 100, 120 of the lizards. Now, what this involves, you hold the lizard upside down, you get a syringe of water, and a needle with a ball at the end. So it's a very dull needle, it doesn't hurt the lizard at all. You can actually slip it down their throat, pump water into their stomach, and they regurgitate everything they've eaten in the last 24 hours or so. It's pretty extraordinary sometimes. It smells awful. That's the one time where it's really good to not have doors or windows. But it gives us a really interesting look at what the lizards are eating. All right, so we did all of this last year. We did it again this year. So now the question, 1 year has passed, what's changed? So here's a picture I took in 2017, last year.
Wow.
Here's a picture in the same place.
Wow! This is dry season.
Yes, so that's...
It's gonna get better.
I'll do that one more time, because that was a nice...
Wow.
So, as Shauna said, this is dry season. Everything that you see brown here is going to be green as soon as there's enough water.
It was in
But
August.
it's totally different. There's grass everywhere. Last year it was a dust bowl. We were just constantly coated in
Dirt.
aerosolized guano.
Yeah.
This year, all of that vegetation has locked in the soil, creating all of these really exciting processes that's going to bolster all of this primary productivity, all this plant growth. From there, we get insects. So we saw these clouds of butterflies flying, greeting our helicopter. And once you have insects, you've got happy lizards and birds, and the whole bit is coming together. So there were lots of birds, lots of fluffy little baby birds, lots of eggs. Shauna is actually going tomorrow to get a full count, an inventory of how the birds are doing. But I would say they're doing well.
Yeah.
But what about the lizards? So, you remember that visual encounter survey that we did around the whole island? Well, last year we found 67 tree lizards and 92 ground lizards. This year,
Wow.
increased to 169, 136. That's a lot.
A lot. Wow.
Now these are the marker capture sites. Remember, the rock area was how things kind of were, and the tree area is how things are gonna be. Last year we found 8 lizards on the first day, and about 8 on the second day. We caught 3 new ones, so the population is probably around 11. In the tree we found 17, things were better. And the next day we got 15, so maybe the population was about 20 in the tree. This year we caught 37 in the rocks. The next day we caught just about the same. So we think there's about 40 lizards in exactly the same area that there were about 9 or 10 last year. And the trees,
Wow.
we caught 58 on the first day. We couldn't believe it. And on the second day, we were over 50 as well. Here's lizard number 50. We're very proud. So it looks like the tree lizards have nearly tripled in density, and the ground lizards have maybe almost doubled just in 1 year. It's really exciting. Now, what about some of those evolutionary changes? So I mentioned we took behavioral data about how the lizards are interacting with their environment and with the other things in their environment. One of the theories is that behavior is, we call it evolutionary labile. It's easy to change your behavior, and so maybe that would be the first thing to evolve differences. So we have these different metrics of how afraid lizards are. We call them flight characteristics. So here's the cartoon, ready? So here I am walking in, scaring a lizard. It starts running, and at the point where it starts running, we take a measurement. So that's called the flight initiation distance, how close you can get to the lizard. Now that lizard is going to run somewhere else where it feels safe. That's called the flight distance. And then we also record the final distance. How far did that lizard end up away from us? Now in 2017, we found that we could get to about 2 meters, within 2 meters of the ground lizards. They would run about 3/4 of a meter and end up about 2.5 meters away from us. The tree lizards let us get a lot closer, I think because they knew we couldn't actually catch them with our hands. So we were getting within about a meter of them, 80 centimeters or so on average. They would run about 30 centimeters and end up about a meter away from us. So how have things changed? Well, the ground lizards let us get a lot closer, about 1.5 meters away on average. They run a little bit further, but still end up closer to us than they would have last year. Tree lizards did something a little different. So they still let us get about as close, but they run significantly further and end up significantly further away from us. So what we're seeing is that the ground lizards are getting less shy, whereas the tree lizards are getting more shy. It's a little unexpected, but I'll show you a picture that I think explains it. Now we had questions about habitat use for the anoles. We didn't actually find any differences. And I think this picture, it kind of makes sense why. Lizards want to live on trees, and there just aren't trees yet, or the trees that there are about the height of my knee. So soon, I think these lizards are going to change, but this actually confirms our prediction that they're waiting for the vegetation to change to the vegetation that they would prefer to be in, a tree. Now we also looked at all of those different measurements. We didn't find significant differences for the tree lizard, in part, mostly because we think that they are still using the habitat in the same way. But the ground lizard's arms are changing. In the last year, the average length of the arms has actually increased. Now the ground lizards don't have to cling in the same way that those poor tree anoles in Turks and Caicos did. They mostly live under rocks, or they certainly spend the night under rocks, and during the day they're out running. But we know from other experiments with high-speed videos watching these lizards run that the ones with longer arms relative to their legs are actually more maneuverable. So these lizards seem to be adapting to running through these grasses and rocks at a much more active pace and much more maneuverably. That is interesting. So, in terms of diet, we found that the lizards, the tree lizards were eating a lot of the same things that they were last year. They love ants, and so they're just gobbling down the ants. All of them were very healthy looking. They were very full and happy. But they're still eating about the same thing, ants. The ground lizards, though, had some new stuff in the diet that was really surprising, specifically meat. They are becoming pretty voracious carnivores. One of the things that really surprised us is we saw a lot of fish in their stomachs. Now, these are not swimming lizards. They're not going down. They're not going down the cliffs to go catch fish. But what they are doing is enjoying the fish brought back to the nests by the birds. So it turns out when you come around a rock and surprise a booby, sometimes if its stomach is full, it's going to regurgitate what it just ate so that it can get flying off the cliff edge and escape. Now, as you can see, this particular booby had quite a lot of fish in it. And I'm sure immediately after I left, these ground lizards would run in and just be super happy about this meal delivered. So there's a source of the fish. We also found that the ground lizards were eating the tree lizards.
No.
Now this is a bit of a surprise. Here you can see a very excited ground lizard chewing on this particular tree lizard. Fortunate. So this happened 3 times that we saw. We also saw a large male actually eating a baby ground lizard. So they're becoming very, very predatory. They've kind of assumed the mantle of top
Apex
predator on the island. Okay, so that was an interesting change too. What about the geckos? It was interesting. We did the same survey this year. We saw about the same number of these dwarf geckos, and so it seems like they haven't magnified in the same way as the others. I think that has a little bit to do with the community. We're still trying to work that out. So quite a lot of this other gecko, though. This is actually an invasive, not supposed to be here, but there's a lot of them, and they are starting to show up in diets as well. All right, so I want to make sure that we have time for questions, so I'm going to buzz through this a little bit. How have things changed so far? Wow, vegetation. Lizard density has substantially increased. The ground lizards seem to be getting less fearful, and the tree lizards are getting more wary. The ground lizard's diet now includes more meat, including anoles and juvenile ground lizards. And the ground lizard arm seems to be changing to facilitate more maneuverable locomotion. So I'm very, very pleased to say the Redonda restoration effort is off to a great start. I want to leave you with a few final thoughts about conservation, just to tie this all up into a bigger picture. Now, conservation used to be focused on putting fences around unique places and then calling the plants and animals protected. This is only moderately successful. So now we're increasingly thinking about conservation in light of the fact that plants and animals can move. So, vis-a-vis climate change, we can now protect areas that provide refuge from changing climate conditions. This is actually a conservation map from Canada showing how trees are expected to move as climate changes. So this is a really exciting new perspective on conservation that gives us past just putting walls around conserved species. But what about rapid evolution? So this is a really exciting time for evolutionary biologists with the realization that evolution is happening constantly, even in our backyards. This is a bit of a trick for conservation, though, because it means that species are now moving targets in terms of their needs and abilities in the ecosystem. That said, I'm immensely hopeful because I think we can start leveraging the knowledge of evolutionary biologists and about evolution to help let plants and animals help us help them to adapt to their surroundings. So, a few things that we know. Many species are highly adaptable, but they do need some time to adapt. Environmental changes need to be consistent and predictable for evolution to help a species fit into a human-dominated landscape. Now that's harkening back to the hurricanes, that if conditions change next year, or maybe the next hurricane that hits Turks and Caicos brings lots of rain instead of wind, well, the lizards will have a different signal to adapt to, and it might be harder for them to, for us to predict how best to aid in conserving them. We also know that populations need to be big and stable enough to have enough diversity for evolution to work. But the bottom line is species are constantly evolving on intertwined evolutionary paths, and so conserving them can be made easier and more effective by leveraging evolutionary insights. So it's really exciting to me that Redonda, after only 1 year, has already shown us so much of an extensive recovery and can begin telling us more and more about evolution and conservation. All right, so with that, I'd like to thank a lot of people, including the government of Antigua and Barbuda, the Department of Environment. Had a lot of support from the Environmental Awareness Group and Fauna and Flora International. Shauna Challenger, Jenny Daltrey, Biz Bell were instrumental in facilitating different parts of this work, and Anthony Harrell and Jeff Giller, who's up here in the front, both helped me with all of the data collection on Redonda. So with that, I'd love to answer any questions you might have.
I'm just curious to try and understand why some of the lizards are less timid and others are more timid in terms of flight distance and so on.
Yeah, so just to repeat the question, she was asking why some lizards got less timid and other lizards got more timid. And that's where I noticed the clock and we got a little back. So the ground lizards, we think, were very afraid of the rats. When we were there last year, their tails were just constantly being munched. They had scars from these encounters with these rats that were becoming, daytime predators. It was really weird. And so now that the rats are gone, these ground lizards know that they're at the top of the heap. And so they're less concerned about other predators eating them. But the tree lizards suddenly found a new predator that used to be really afraid but is now feeling much more confident. And so the tree lizards are becoming more wary. That said, even though the ground lizards seem to be eating the tree lizard density has still tripled. And so this is probably more how the ecosystem should be. It's not actually a problem. Yeah.
All right. So two questions. One kind of harks back to the turkey cages example. So I'm curious to know about the history of hurricanes and turkey cages and how that could have driven previous modifications versus what you're seeing now. So is this just a rapid change to an event, but maybe it's not the fittest change for them, or do you predict that this, based on history, this may be a long-term change?
So that's a great question. The question is, to what extent did the pattern that we see relate to just the storm, or is there more evolutionary history that we can use to inform these patterns? Are things going to revert to a different state? And that's one that we're really wrestling with. We don't know. Of course, hurricanes are really common. And so these populations have absolutely been blasted by hurricanes in the past. But they're not happening every year, and not happening every year in the same way. And so what we think is happening is, by and large, what actually determines whether a lizard is going to survive and reproduce in a given year is how good it is at catching food and claiming a mate. And so for most of the year, that's going to hold sway over the traits that get passed on to the next generation. And it's only in these little windows where we see this evolutionary jog down a different path. And so we got evidence of one of these jogs that lasted about 6 weeks. I have a feeling that things are going to kind of creep back to the way they were until there's another perturbation, and things will change again. Perturbation, anything bad happening. Yeah.
How long is a lizard's life?
Yeah, so it depends. These anoles on Redunda are actually pretty long-lived for anoles. We think they live between 3 and 5 years. Watsy, living here, probably only lives 1 or 2 years. The ground lizards probably live even longer. We don't really know, but I would guess 5 to 7 years would be a good bet. You got a question?
Yeah, seeing on these changes in the population size for the species you're talking about, doubling, tripling, how's the age structure distribution of the population? Should there be a lot more juveniles and sub-adults? And would you put that down to predation or increased food payments because the vegetation is towards more insects?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, we would expect that given that the population has increased so much, we'd see a lot of really young lizards. And that is actually what we saw. I didn't give data on that, but there were many more juvenile lizards this year than we saw in the previous years. And I think that's exactly what's happening. There's this new food source, or new food availability, fewer predators in the rats, and so lizards are having more babies, and more of those eggs and baby lizards are surviving to become adults. And so, yeah, we are seeing a demographic
And
shift.
then eventually will change and stabilise in a
And yeah, that would be the prediction. Yep, that would be the prediction.
Can I have a question in the back?
Yep, just, I promise, yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is not a lizard question, but I'm really fascinated to know how the goats are doing here in Antigua. If they're getting on okay, are they surviving? Are they happy?
They're very rude. Very rude goats from Barbuda.
So that is beyond my expertise, I'm afraid. I am a lizard guy, and so you'll have to direct that to the Department of Agriculture or somebody else. Yeah, question in the back.
What I'm thinking right now, as the topography improves on Uganda, and as things are beginning to be restored, perhaps other species will come into the play and probably change the lifestyle of some of the lizards that are there. Because Uganda is not going to stay like that. It did have trees before. It did have some flowers and stuff going back in its history. So we are trying to create that and trying to develop that. We're going to certainly have changes because with other species come other behaviors. So ultimately, we might even see a change in the type of lizards that we do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so I am going to be coming back and re-measuring the lizards and continuing to watch Redonda. I think we're going to see, yeah, lots of new interesting behaviors and kind of a cycling back to how it was. Yeah, thanks for the question.
What are the animals?
No, I don't know. We really need an insect expert. If any of you young students are looking for a project, go out and learn insects because you have a fascinating collection of bugs in your backyard. That,
More than one species of animals?
definitely lots of species of ants. And probably, well, it's very conceivable that they are specialists on Redonda.
Can I just jump in there? There's actually a beetle that is only found in the nest of the brown boobies on Redonda. So we do have quite a lot of special. We just.
So if you didn't hear that in the back, there are specialist beetles
Yeah.
living on Redonda that are only found in the nests of the brown boobies. That's how specialized some of these different insects can be. And we just don't know anything about them.
Something like the dung beetle.
Yeah, absolutely. Any questions for the back? Yeah.
Is there any evidence that the ground lizards eat birds?
Yes, there is. I haven't actually seen a lizard open an egg, but if an egg rolls and cracks, they will gobble up the innards really happily. I wouldn't be surprised if a really clever lizard would figure out to roll an egg on a hill.
Assuming they might develop them.
I haven't seen that yet, but it certainly is conceivable. But the eggs are a really good protein source, and so as soon as they're open, lizards go right for it.
Talking about eggs.
It just simply happens.
Their arms are longer now. Wouldn't that be attributed to food? That their arms would grow longer because of the food?
Yeah. Terrific question. Okay, so up front, we had the question that we found that the ground lizard arms were getting longer, but that could be attributed to just more food. They're getting, more food, so they're eating more. The way that we make sure that's not the case is that we measure all of the lizards in a standard way to measure their body size. And so we know, of course, bigger lizards have bigger legs and bigger heads. And so we can mathematically correct for differences in body size to look at what we call the relative arm length. And so that means that if you mushed all of the lizards to be exactly the same size, some of them would have proportionally longer legs or proportionally shorter legs. That's just a thought experiment. She wouldn't actually mush the lizard, sorry. And you can tell if there are relative differences that aren't attributed just to growth. Yeah, question in the back. Sorry,
Yes, basically my question would be along the same running with the legs. I was very surprised that within 365 days you would find a lizard changing the length. I was going to ask what would attribute to that, because like that is just, in terms of time, that's just about a minute ago. We're talking just about a minute in terms of time for this to happen. And also, why would it do this if there isn't any reason really, because it's much easier to get food now? Longer legs mean you're going faster or something.
Yep. Which means that other evolutionary processes may be happening behind the scenes that are a little bit harder to weed out just by observing the population. So this is all really technical. I don't think we need to go into it, but there are, for example, plastic changes is what we would call your change in a trait relative to your environment that actually changes as you grow up. And so if a young lizard that is a little bit better at running fast because they have long arms gets more food, it might be able to sort of, within its single lifetime, grow longer legs. There's some complicated genetics and epigenetics underneath all of these processes that we can't really rule out by just measuring the populations. What we can say is that the limbs got longer. In terms of why that might be useful, well, we can really just have some stories that we don't really know. My thought is that there's a lot of competition for space and resources now, even though their resources are more abundant. And so lizards that are better able to cruise through the undergrowth or very rapidly get to some vomited out fish or an egg that broke up will have an advantage. And so even if you're not starving, it's still advantageous to be the best. And so these changes in morphology related to locomotion are still going to give you an advantage, even if conditions aren't as rough as they used to be.
Would you say that due to the fact that now a little more vegetation is growing, and you have new baby lizards and so on that are growing up in an environment that has more vegetation for them to get through, would you say it's like an athlete who trains to be faster, to get to the finish line quicker than someone else? Would you say that, say, a baby lizard that is now born into that becomes quicker and gets more food and wins more is going to be stronger, like an athlete trains to win more?
So there's a component of that, but we actually also are measuring bones, and so it's hard to grow your bone just by exercising, and so there's I think all of those bits and pieces are all playing a role. I think that's entirely possible. Yeah.
Quick question regarding the change in diet to fish.
Yes.
So when you were looking at it, you came around a corner or came over a rock. The bird got scared, vomited fish. Yeah. But without human presence, what's leading to that?
So these
fish
are my
diet being available?
Yeah, sorry, full of cells. These ground lizards are definitely harassing birds and especially chicks. And so, parents are out foraging for fish that they then feed to their offspring who can't fly yet, and they regurgitate it into the mouth of a baby chick. Now, if the chick was harassed by the ground lizards, got really stressed, then it might regurgitate the fish as well, giving that ground lizard a tasty treat. And so we definitely saw lizards harassing chicks. I think that could very easily be what's going on. Yeah.
Are you at all more worried for the geckos than before?
Yes. So good question. I think that has to do with the dwarf geckos whose numbers seem not to have increased tremendously. I'm not worried about them. There's a lot of dwarf geckos still there. We found a tripling of the tree lizards, but the dwarf gecko population seems to be very stable, and they're pretty well protected from a lot of the things that would negatively impact them, especially now that rats aren't there anymore. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see dwarf gecko populations increasing, but just increasing a little bit slower. Yeah.
Did you measure the size of the lizard's egg?
We did not. Okay, so the question was whether we measured the lizard eggs. We did not, but that's a really interesting variable in all of this. We would expect that if mother lizards are better fed, their eggs would be larger, giving their offspring a better chance of success. So that is absolutely a prediction that we would expect to be true. We just didn't have a chance to measure them. So again, if anybody's looking for a conservation project, go measure lizard eggs. I'll tell you now. There's a question over here.
Have the ground lizards grown teeth? How do they attack the tree lizards? What do they do to eat them?
Yeah, to eat them. So the question is about the ground lizard mouth and specifically the teeth. They've always had teeth. They're kind of teeth. They're more like bumpy bones in their jaws. And they seem to be doing just fine with the teeth that they've got. So we didn't measure the teeth per se. I don't know if they're getting bigger or smaller. I bet that they're probably not changing very much because they're pretty effective as is.
Do they bite hard?
They do bite hard. So one of the things that we measured was actually the bite force.
Wow.
And yeah, they bite pretty hard. they won't actually hurt you. It hasn't really gotten stronger over the year. That was one of the things that we were looking at, and we haven't seen a big difference. But I wouldn't be surprised if it changes in the future. Yes?
I know that there was increase of tree lizards in 2018, but are you at all worried about decreasing numbers in the number of tree lizards because of the increased competition between them and the ground lizards and them eating?
Yeah, so this is exactly how ecosystems work. The ground lizards will continue to increase until their resources run out. We call that a carrying capacity. That's the maximum number of a population that an ecosystem can support. And so eventually, they're going to reach that number and stay about the same. They won't decrease, but they won't be increasing anymore. It's possible that some populations overshoot this carrying capacity, causing a crash, and they kind of get closer and closer to the carrying capacity over time. That could certainly happen, but I think they still have room to increase. As soon as those trees start getting over my head, they're going to have lots of new habitat, and they're going to be really happy. So I think for a while, we're going to have a lot more tree lizards coming on the Goodwin. Yeah.
Are you guys gonna plant any trees?
You know, that's a question for flora and fauna. I'm certainly not.
Okay.
That's for under restoration. Excuse me.
We don't have any plans to revegetate.
Okay.
As you can see, when we last year, as we started with just rocks, and people from forestry kept asking, okay, Shanna, we have the trees ready. When you want to dig and looking in the museum and looking at the historical records and all of that, we are just letting nature just do its thing. As you can see, it didn't need any help. Well, it needed a little help from us, just for us to take away the rats and the goats, and it's doing its thing. One thing, Colin, we didn't get any pictures of them in there, but we actually have a lot of seedlings of trees that are about this high. Quite a number of them actually all around the island, and so yes. So the birds, some of the birds, we had like the red-footed boobies and the magnificent frigate birds. They were the only two. Imagine nesting on an island that has no trees, and you're a tree nesting bird, and so they were just limited to the cliffs. And so we've actually seen the first red booby on the island because we have these new trees coming up. So we don't have any plans to, but we do have. If we do have to, we do have like historical records of the vegetation that was previously found there. Okay, so one thing that we have over there, of course, is the jumping cacti. I'm sure everybody has heard of that. Very excited. Okay, everybody seeing me? Sorry, I should probably be standing. It's basically a cactus. It doesn't, me and my boss were talking about it. If you go slow and if you watch it, it doesn't do anything to you. It's like, I know you're watching me, I'm not going to do anything. But if you walk past quickly, it will, you'll just fight, I'll walk past it, it's here, and by the time I get down there, I'll just see the spikes in me. Yep. They do dig quite deeply, and as you try to take them out, they kind of go deeper, but it's fine. It's not just a little prick. But we have record that agaves used to be there. Like we have pictures of it. They used to be there. So dagger logs, shrubs, all of those kind of things. Right now we only have a ficus tree, and we used to have a casuarina, but we killed that because that was invasive. But definitely bougainvillea apparently even used to be out there, right? And we have had a number of land birds come on. So we have Senada doves, the ones that those ones are over there. We have gray kingbirds, we have swallows, so a lot more. Since more land birds are coming, we do think that when the shrubs and all those other trees come back, they'll be like, hey, let's make here our home. Yes.
Thanks, Sean.
Great questions. Any more questions? Yeah.
How do you get rid of that?
The rats. That's also probably a better question for Sean.
Okay,
Luckily, it wasn't my job.
So for the rat eradication, we basically lived in the same area that Colin was staying for about 2 months, and we did it basically in 3 ways. The first thing that we did is that we divided the island into different lines. And so every morning, bright and early, we're done, the wake-up time is about 4:30 while it's still cool before the sun comes out and kills you. You get those 1.5-liter bottles, the size above this, and you cut off the end so you have a little tunnel, right? You know, rats love tunnels. We wire the bait in, so put 4 pieces of bait, and you write down every morning how much bait blocks you're putting, the station that you're at, and all of that, and you do that all day for all the entire lines of the island. In the evening, you would come back home, have a little dinner and everything. Next morning, you wake up and you see how many bait blocks are left. And one thing with our rat bait was that it was a slow-killing one. It wasn't one that just knock you out quickly and say, hey, cousin so-and-so gone now, what happened to them? You know, it wasn't anything like that. It took 3 days actually to take effect, and so it killed them by internal bleeding. So a very peaceful, painful, painless, a very peaceful, painless death, and it encouraged them. The blocks we use are claret, of course. We use them for all of our offshore islands, and you only have to eat a quarter of the block really to die. But the rats that we done, it was during the dry season, like right now, and so the rats were very, very hungry, and they had never had this food before, and they say, "Hi, something new over there, right? Let me eat this, right?" So we did that on the top of the most flat parts of the island. We also had mountain climbers come in, and so we were they were on the cliffs, sling shots and bait. It was very dramatic and everything. We also went down the gully, we would swim in some areas to get to the coastline, put it all around there. There's also the little stacks of islands that you saw we helicopter dropped as well. So it was a combination of all those things that made us get rid of the rats. We're 99.9999% sure that the rats are gone. According to international protocols, we have to wait a year. So not my trip tomorrow, but next month or so we'll be doing the final 1-year check, staying out there for about a week to ensure that there's no rats, but we haven't seen any rat signs since March 27th. The bait only attacks mammals. So the crabs, I hate crabs. Crabs, they eat them, they eat it a lot, but they just must be delicious. It doesn't affect them at all. But don't eat any crabs around the dump.
There's a question in the back. Do I remember correctly? Is there? Yeah.
Yes, I was asking, why was the rat population decreasing?
So, the rat population decreased when we eradicated them. The rats were doing great before the poison came on the island. Yeah, there were about 6,000, and so the rats were having a field day until we intervened. Yes. They didn't eat the rats. That would have been really helpful. No, they're pretty afraid of the rats. The rats would actually nibble on them. And so, it would have worked much better the other way around had the lizards been able to eat the rats. Yeah.
What do you think the rats were important in the ecosystem?
I'm sorry?
What do you think the rats were important in the ecosystem?
No. Rats, of course, are invasive species, and they are originally from India, all the way over there. And back when the mining company was there, I don't know if everybody knows rats can swim for about an hour before they get tired. There's a number of shipwrecks around Barbuda. They could have just swam up the island. Of course, there's a bunch of eggs, there's a bunch of birds, there's a bunch of lizards. Oh, there's so much food here. I'm staying here. I'm never leaving. And that's why they came on, and because they're invasive and they were harming our species, we decided, hey, we need to step in, kill them, move on. Yeah.
Yeah, another question? Yeah, what is it? Sorry, I missed that. Yeah, so predators of the lizards, I assume. Yeah. So the predators of, well, the lizards are predators of the other lizards. There are also a couple of new birds of prey. There's a couple of peregrine falcons, I think, living on the island, which is also very exciting. They're a beautiful bird species. So I bet they would eat some of the lizards as well. I wouldn't worry about the lizards. They're going to be fine. But a few more predatory bird species would be really exciting. So that's something that we'll definitely be monitoring in the future.
And I would say that on the offshore islands where we have the razor snake, of course razor snakes eat 1 brown lizard a month, that's their diet. And we've actually found on the islands that we've removed the rats, the lizard population goes up as well as the snake. So they're directly proportional to, my biology teachers are looking at me like I should know this. Directly proportional, so they'll grow with each other.
All right, well, I think if you have any other questions of Dr. Donihue, well, we've been hanging around for a couple minutes while we clean up, so come ask him. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to plug at the State College on Tuesday and Wednesday, so tomorrow and Wednesday night, there's the Conference for Academic Research and Development, so there's 6 talks